idea that China is going to end up like a Western-style society is a nonsense. China will remain China. There are two different eras, really. I think that the Deng era, I mean, Deng's genius was to understand where China was in the 1970s after Mao's death, and to set out a strategy for transforming China. How could China drag itself out of this poverty and backwardness? He just prioritized really two things. One, economic growth, and two, taking, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And everything else was secondary. Or to put it another way, everything else had to be done in order to achieve those two objectives. So the aim of foreign policy, for example, was to create the best possible international conditions for this economic transformation. And of course it was a huge success. I mean, 30 odd years, 10% growth every year, taking 700 million people out of poverty. I mean, most extraordinary achievements. And by 2010, 2011, China was close to being the size of the American economy. So Deng's strategy was extraordinarily successful. It created a situation where something else, it was so successful that it sort of dug its own grave, if you like. The country needed to move on. It needed to have a different way of thinking. It needed a different paradigm. There was a Deng paradigm and there was a new paradigm needed. And the new paradigm had two main characteristics, I think. One was that the Chinese economy had to move on from a relatively, simplistic basis of cheap labour, especially migrant labour, in pretty basic industries, making pretty basic goods overwhelmingly for export. And now the requirement and the possibility was for China to be Chinese economy to be completely different, to move up the value chain, to become technologically much more sophisticated, to develop a much bigger domestic market and not be so dependent on the export market, to raise the productivity of labour and capital. This was the new paradigm, or what I would call actually the first element of the Xi era. And the second was that China had essentially, its identity had been overwhelmingly an economic identity. It was almost like, China Limited. Its identity was its economy, and its achievement was its economy. That idea is based on the notion that somehow all of this economic growth would have taken place anyway, even if the state hadn't been involved. Why? Through markets? No, it doesn't work like that. I mean, markets have a very important role to play. But, who's giving the sense of direction? I think the Chinese state has been absolutely crucial to this. Without the Chinese state, it would not have happened in anything like the way that it has. But now, China was in a position where it could start thinking of itself in a very different way. It needed to exercise not just economic influence, because you reach a point where your economic influence also needs broader political influence in the world. And so China began to set itself the goal of becoming not just an economic power, but a political power, ideological power, if you like, or a cultural power, and also a military power. In other words, having comprehensive power, or China begins to take the first steps to becoming a great power. So I regard those two elements to be constituting a new era, which for the sake of argument, I'll call the Xi era.